Once upon a time, in a small, secluded village on the edge of a dense, ancient forest, lived a beautiful young girl named Vasilisa. She was known throughout the village for her kindness, grace, and beauty. But Vasilisa's life was anything but easy. When she was just a little girl, her mother, a kind-hearted woman whom she adored, fell gravely ill. Before she passed away, Vasilisa's mother called her close and gave her a small wooden doll with eyes that seemed to twinkle with a life of their own. "Keep this doll close to you, Vasilisa," her mother whispered, weak but resolute. "When you feel lost or afraid, give her a small piece of bread, and she will help you. She will guide you and protect you, my dear girl." With those final words, her mother kissed her forehead, and the life faded from her eyes. After her mother's death, Vasilisa's father eventually remarried, bringing a new woman and her 2 daughters into their home. The new stepmother was a cold, envious woman with a harsh face and eyes that burned with resentment whenever they rested on Vasilisa. Her stepsisters were no better, they were bitter and jealous, for they despised Vasilisa's beauty and grace, seeing her as a constant reminder of their own shortcomings. Soon, Vasilisa's life became one of servitude. Her stepmother forced her to do all the housework, cook the meals, fetch water from the well, and clean every corner of the house until her hands were raw and her spirit was worn. Despite the harsh treatment, Vasilisa endured it without complaint. Every night, when the day's labor left her exhausted and in tears, she would remember her mother's words and reach for the doll. She would place a small piece of bread in the doll's tiny mouth and pour out her troubles. Miraculously, the doll seemed to come alive, its wooden eyes warming with understanding and compassion. "Do not be afraid, Vasilisa," the doll would whisper, filling her heart with comfort. "Tomorrow, I will help you with your chores." And indeed, whenever Vasilisa asked, the doll would lend her a hand, making sure that her stepmother and stepsisters never discovered how the difficult tasks were magically completed overnight. But her stepmother's cruelty knew no bounds. As the winter solstice drew near, the stepmother decided it was time to rid herself of Vasilisa once and for all. She devised a wicked plan, knowing that deep in the dark forest lived the infamous Baba Yaga, a fearsome witch who was known to eat children, especially those who dared to wander into her domain uninvited. One cold, dark evening, as a chilling wind howled outside, Vasilisa's stepmother called her over. "Vasilisa," she said with a twisted smile, "we are out of firewood, and the house is dark. You must go into the forest to seek Baba Yaga. Ask her for fire, and do not return without it." Vasilisa was terrified. She had heard the stories of Baba Yaga, a twisted, ancient witch who lived in a hut that stood on massive chicken legs, surrounded by a fence made of bones and skulls. Villagers spoke of how she flew through the air in a mortar and pestle, how she could control animals, and how her hunger for flesh knew no bounds. But Vasilisa had no choice. She gathered her courage, packed a few crumbs of bread, and tucked her mother's doll into her pocket. As she ventured into the forest, shadows twisted and danced around her, and the trees seemed to whisper warnings. She shivered with fear, but she reached for her doll and whispered, "Please, little doll, guide me safely." The doll, sensing her fear, murmured, "Do not be afraid, Vasilisa. Keep walking, and you will find what you seek." Through the night, Vasilisa walked deeper into the forest, past twisted branches and eerie silence, until at last, she saw a faint glow through the trees. She soon found herself in front of Baba Yaga's hut, a terrifying sight. It stood on 2 massive chicken legs, towering over her, and around it was a fence adorned with skulls, each one with hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The hut turned slowly to face her, and the ground trembled as it settled down, bending its legs to let Baba Yaga herself step out. Baba Yaga was as terrifying as the stories had described. Her body was bent and twisted, her face old and wrinkled, her nose long and sharp. Her iron teeth glinted in the dim light as she smiled a crooked smile, her eyes glimmering with malice and curiosity. "What brings you here, child?" Baba Yaga hissed, her voice as rough as crackling wood. "Why have you dared to come to my hut?" Summoning all her courage, Vasilisa replied, "Grandmother Baba Yaga, my stepmother has sent me to ask you for fire. Our home has grown cold and dark, and I am not to return without it." Baba Yaga's eyes narrowed, and she cackled, sending shivers down Vasilisa's spine. "Very well," she said with a cruel grin. "I will give you fire, but first, You must earn it. If you can complete 3 tasks for me, I shall grant you what you seek. But fail, her eyes glinted as she leaned closer, and you will become my supper. With no other choice, Vasilisa agreed. That night, Baba Yaga gave her the first task: clean my hut from top to bottom, and leave not a speck of dust. Scrub every corner until it sparkles. The task was daunting. The hut was cluttered with strange objects, ancient bones, jars of mysterious herbs, and webs clinging to every corner. Vasilisa despaired, but when Baba Yaga retired to sleep, she took out her doll and whispered, "Please, help me." The doll's eyes sparkled, and it whispered, "Sleep now, Vasilisa. When you wake, the work will be done." In the morning, Vasilisa awoke to find the hut spotless. Every surface gleamed, and not a single web remained. Baba Yaga inspected the hut, grumbling in irritation but saying nothing. For the second task, Baba Yaga led Vasilisa to an enormous pile of poppy seeds mixed with grains of corn. By sunrise, separate every poppy seed from every grain of corn, she commanded, her voice dripping with malice. The pile was massive, and Vasilisa's heart sank. She knew it was impossible to complete such a task alone, so she once again turned to her doll. As she slept, the doll tirelessly worked, and by morning, every seed was sorted perfectly. Baba Yaga's frustration was clear, but she assigned the final task with a twisted grin. The third and final task was the most difficult. Vasilisa was to fetch water from a deep, enchanted well in a leaky bucket, then cook Baba Yaga's dinner without spilling a single drop. With the doll's encouragement and guidance, Vasilisa managed the impossible task by filling the bucket with moss to keep the water from leaking and cooking Baba Yaga's meal with care. Finally, seeing that Vasilisa had completed all 3 tasks, Baba Yaga had no choice but to keep her promise. She grumbled, then plucked a glowing skull from her fence and handed it to Vasilisa. "Take this fire and leave, but heed my warning, do not return to this forest." With the skull's eerie light illuminating her path, Vasilisa made her way home. When she arrived, she found her stepmother and stepsisters waiting for her. But as soon as she stepped through the door, the skull's fire flared to life, and its light consumed her cruel stepmother and stepsisters, turning them to ash. Vasilisa was finally free.